urban and architectural dimension, following more social segregation rather than social cohesion. So focusing on providing luxury or high standard architecture, but you can see from the small scale that it's basically segregated. All blocks are segregated from each other, and the street was not a Syrian culture in dividing the neighborhood into different zones. So the proposal has a luxury aspect, but basically it doesn't capture social and cultural aspects that affecting or that's generated from the Syrian culture. And this is basically important because this represents a loss or a loss in social and cultural intangible values that really needed to be considered in the generation process or the reconstruction process. And that's what led me to apply for a British Council research fund called, my proposal was titled Regenerating Accepted Cities in the Middle East After Crisis. This fund, we won it in collaboration with the University of Jordan, and we are going to conduct it during summer, but it might be postponed. Let's see how it goes. If I cancel the video now. Instead of oh, come on. Maybe the other slide is coming, but another phenomena or another trend started appearing during the conflict. It's what we started calling heritage mobility. So this is a Zatari camp. I need to go back. A Zatari refugees camp in Jordan at the southern border of Syria. The camp is, of course, following United Nations standard camp resolution, which basically normal cabinets provided to provide shelter for people with a normal grid. The interesting things in this camp, after 1 year, the camp started kind of in a very rigid grid, and after 1 year, the camp started to start having different shapes and different organization. Interesting study started to by UCL scholar started to explore how this camp or how this trend is forming spatial quality or the quality of the space and the spatial settings of the space. So you can see how the camp started here and how people start to configuring the urban or the landscape of the camp in a way to shape their own spaces. That's hugely affected by their cultural and social aspects and how the family bonds and the social aspect and the concept, mostly the concept of courtyards and the concept of social cohesion around an open space for the community, which basically, if you look back to the example I showed you for Marota city, is completely lost. And using very simple slide, very simple material available in the camp. You know, permanent materials, permanent building material is not allowed to the camp. So using the actual containers provided to the camp with some tents, people started to configure the urban space and create some open spaces for families or for communities to create their own communities. And more importantly, create the what do they call the souk trend in the Middle East, where it is the market where people go and shop and socialize as well. And this is what they call it. Thanks for one of the Dundee scholars, Dr. Hussam Loir, who brought some fresh information from this camp. They call it Sham-Élysées, kind of inspired by Sham-Élysées in France. So this is, you can see, this is the last resolution of the camp from the main street, which is the main market of the camp. So this is not about only the spatial setting, but also the economic and the craftsmanship and the everyday life settings of Syrian community in a very simple resolution. So it's really important to emphasize in the beginning of this presentation, before I move to the archaeological heritage, that there is important heritage we are losing in terms of crisis, which is the intangible social and architectural values of our cities, of our neighborhoods. So that's really important to back up any future plans for regenerating our cities after any crisis in terms of conflict in this case. But of course, conflict is a devastating event for heritage and archaeological heritage in particular. Syria is a well-known country about the diversity of heritage that go or range between the early Bronze Age into late 19th century. Very diverse heritage from different periods. It physically existed in the country, but also some of them are existed in a very single building, like Umayyad Mosque, which represent layering from very early stages of before Christianity until nowadays. Basically, all layers are fully explicitly presented. So this is a very sad picture of the explosion of the temple of Balashim, of Bal in particular, in Palmyra. This temple is not, Palmyra is mostly known as Roman city, but this temple goes back to Canaanite in Bronze Age, and the origin of this temple, or the original archaeological evidence of this temple, brings back to Canaanite time, Bronze Age, 2000 BC, but it continued to be used and adapted to be reused in Roman time. So this was sad story of losing this temple, but the city, and this particular very important, well-known all over the world city, had another loss. This is the original picture of the temple before the explosion. But it has another loss of very original landmark, which is the Trophy Arch in the city, or the entrance of the city colonnade into the throne, which was also destroyed by ISIS, where when ISIS took over the city for few months, less than 3 or 4 months, no more, basically. So you can see how short time during conflict with intensive armed people can cause destruction. A destruction happened to the old town of Homs, my hometown, where the original market, or the souk, or the covered market was severely affected. In addition to some very key building in the city, this is what's called Ragdam Palace. It's a hotel, but it was a palace in the past. So the original feature of this palace was destroyed. Conflict also opened the window for illegal excavation in the country, and not only, I'm talking about Syria because I have lots of knowledge about that, but in Iraq and other countries that has conflict or has had conflict, it's happening the same, basically. So this is satellite monitoring, 2 pictures before and after in different areas. I'll be showing 2-3 archaeological sites where this area, before the conflict started, and when the conflict started, you can see how the illegal excavation and looting changed the morphology of the archaeological site. But basically, most of the site was looted and started to be sold in the black market. Another satellite monitoring of that give us data how different sites have changed during conflict to showing looting and illegal excavation happening by the armed forces that occupied this area for certain time during these 9 years of conflict. But of course, illegal trade started and lots of artifacts, thanks for collaboration from other countries, lots of artifacts came back to Syria because it was seized in airports or somehow in other countries, but also the country has lost many artifacts that related to its cultural and social aspect of different civilization in the past. So that means it's really losing some identity or some stories that maybe will not be reconstructed or will not be known by future generation. That's why the archaeological mission or the of general antiquities and museum in Syria started to think about how we can use technology to document and allow community to help and take ownership over documenting and preserving and protecting heritage. So one of the initiatives was asking communities in occupied areas where the professionals can't go to send pictures of the damage, but also to the archaeological sites and the historic buildings, documenting first of all the situation, documenting any damage. And the mission in Damascus started to generate kind of database for that to monitor this damage and see how this building or this archaeological site change over time, but also save some data for future generations to for like educational purposes or even for preservation. But of course, this is really important because the impact here on the community, and after community started to be engaged with such acts, community started to save. There are many cases in Syria where community, though supporting some armed that occupy the area, they prevented the armed group from harming the heritage because they took ownership over the heritage protection. And because it's not, they were taught or they were educated that this heritage is related to them, not to the government. So although they are opponent to the government, they didn't ignore their responsibility in saving this heritage. As a result, every area or every site or building started to have a file with all with documentation of damages or changes or any looting happened in this building, which basically add very good storage for information. Yes. So my question here: how technology serve more, or how can technology serve more efficiently the preservation of cultural heritage? Of course, we know that photogrammetry is really great, a great tool now to preserve heritage under risk and start documenting the heritage virtually, saving it for future generation or for future preservation. Most importantly, heritage at risk, like coastal heritage in areas of UK, or even heritage at risk, which basically can completely go because of armed conflict. But also there is real-time reconstruction where it gives the flavor of the photorealistic reconstruction of the heritage and give an engagement tool for people to engage with the reconstructed heritage. And most importantly, not all people, of course all people, but most importantly young generations who will be awareness of the physical representation of heritage, they will only have the digital representation of this heritage. And other tools by dropping 3D reconstruction on ruins to understand the reality within the reconstruction or the value of this heritage within its original context. And this is really important to understand the current situation and the past situation and link them together. Creating apps, all these things I mentioned can contribute to creating apps, VR apps, or even mobile-friendly apps that allow people to synthesize educational and engaging material. I started thinking that, okay, virtual tools is really important to think about reconstructing things going to be missing or missed based on documentation or archival research. This is really key and important. But what about when we are going to do physical conservation? How digital technology can help in that and can aid architects and conservators to establish the right approach. So I applied a very simple, using simple CAD technology. I applied this methodology on the city of Ugarit, Bronze Age site in Syria, as part of my PhD. So this is the site, but I focused on a very unique area, which a meeting plaza between the people and their kingship of the king, where the plaza is a very simple terms where both the royal family and their people meet and socialize or run specific activity. So you can see this is the plaza, this is the palace, and this is tavern, this is some this is bakery, and these are some domestic and commercial functions. So you can see it's very simple plaza, very simple open space linked to the Syrian culture, but also linked to the social cohesion, especially between people and their royal family. So the current situation of this plaza is like what you see in this picture, is ruins, is not understandable by visitors. So my approach to use architecture in preserving this plaza was about installing architectural interventions on the site. But the problem was how I make sure that this architectural intervention is working. So I started architectural and archaeological analysis of the plaza. And the important thing for my approach is to make people aware that 3D modeling is integral part of a very comprehensive process. 3D modeling here is a tool to represent a very, you can see, a very comprehensive flow of actions that is backed by archaeological data and architectural data, not simply using archive to reconstruct something. So basically the process was to reconstructing values rather than reconstructing the physicality of the space. That's why the proposal was put in place in a digital environment to start understanding and criticizing, but evaluating its performance in terms of representing the values needed for this particular space. Basically, the main value was about the concept of plaza and the meeting point, about the social cohesion between people and their royal family. But another it's about understanding the interior, the environment inside public, entertaining, and public entertainment and or everyday life space, which is the tavern or the pub, the the old pub during Bronze Age. So we have archaeological evidence of how they used to serve wine and how we used how the architecture configuration of the place was. What I did basically is just starting to reconstruct simple volumes of this tavern in terms of just a box over covering the space and letting a specific amount of light into the space to reconstruct the internal environment of the dark internal environment of the pub. Okay, I am coming to the end by showing you a video that show both the reconstruction approach for the pub or the internal space and the plaza. We're talking about technology, and technology is a bit those pictures are representing a photorealistic rendering of how the aim, but what I would like to show you is a video that combines these two together, the plaza itself and the internal space, or the reconstruction of the internal space in terms of the relationship between dark and light, and how internal space is perceived when you move into it and when you move outside it. For sure, this is a very simple technology. What I showed before, we have now real-time reconstruction, photogrammetric reconstruction that really enhance the output of this proposal. But this reconstruction makes not to show or to engage people only, but basically meant to first of all allow architects to evaluate the importance or the significant contribution of this proposal, but also they are materials for social consultation, for community consultation, especially local community, those who know a lot about the site and appreciate the site. So that's why if I want to combine both the first part of this presentation about the urban scale and the architecture, the archaeological scale, bottom-up approach doesn't only work alone, but also top-bottom approach that used in Marotta City, for example, never worked. So it's really important to think about another approach now that is a meeting point between top-bottom and bottom-up approach, where the bottom-up approach provides the intensive material that needs to be considered where top-bottom approach is applied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tarek. That was really very interesting. I'm quite impressed and quite fascinated by this contrast between this Marotta city, which is a sort of caricature of a modern city, which could be anywhere in the world, and what you've shown, which seems to be the technology at the service of the resilience of heritage. I thought as well it was absolutely fascinating to see what you described as heritage mobility when you explain how in camps, in refugee camps, for instance, you have a sort of reproduction of antique ways of living in a country which has such a superb heritage for centuries, like Syria. That's my first question, and then I'm going to ask everybody to ask question using the chat bar so that I can see the question and maybe unmute the people or ask the people to unmute themselves. But yes, my first question, can you elaborate a little bit on this idea of heritage mobility? And do you have any other examples of refugee camp or other places, probably not refugee camp, in the region or elsewhere?
So that's why it's important. The problem with heritage mobility, it happens because if you look at If you compare between Canaanite civilization and Mycenaean civilization in Greece, in Crete in particular, you can see those two civilizations, like if we compare Ugarit to Thera, if you know Thera in Akrotiri, so those two cities are identical. Historic data and historic letters found in Ugarit confirm that there were missions, commercial missions between Ugarit and Crete. That's really this influence was coming from those relationship or commercial relation and political relationships between these two civilizations. We name it as influence or architectural influence. It's in a way heritage mobility, because the letters, the historic letter confirmed that there was mission for Ugarit living in Crete, and there was mission from Crete living in Ugarit. The same for influence Egyptian in Ugarit or Hittite Egyptian. But the interesting things about heritage mobility in refugees camps, which happened in Azatari camp in really strong sense, but there is another camp in Jordan called Azarka camp, which is happening a lot as well. It's about how the interesting things is about how people, how much people are important to inform interpretations of heritage, and how much knowledge we are ignoring in a way. They are showing us example of very, very in-depth cultural influence, but how they arrange their places, how they arrange their internal spaces. Information scholars usually ignore. Even there was an idea with a scholar from Cardiff University to work on how to go to the camp and start explore how they arrange their internal space, to see how that is linked to their original cultural aspect. So we are losing a lot of information by ignoring this symbol, but it's really critical to understand people culture and how people heritage. That in a way help us as let's say architects or professionals. We are engaged in research about regenerating cities or regenerating places to consider this data, because it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely, Tarek. I think super, super interesting. I have a question. I don't see who it is, but maybe this person can unmute the mic. I'm just reading. I find it interesting how the example from Syria and how a plan for a modern city doesn't correspond to the local culture. It feels like the new housing development in the UK made the same mistake. They don't include shops, enough parking or green spaces, etc. Yes, I think everywhere in the world from the 60s, when we had to accommodate larger population, we've made this big mistake of not considering how people live correctly. The person who asked the question, would you like to unmute your mic? Because I don't see who you are.
Olga. Yeah, it was just, it struck me that it's not a local problem, it's not local to the UK. It feels like the architecture is being in many places developed completely independent from thinking about the lifestyle and the needs of people. It was interesting to see that it happened.
This is really mainly, this is really mainly about because of the top-bottom approach. Of course, we have sometimes we have to accommodate, we have to respond to a challenge, but thinking through this, or rapid thinking or sudden thinking or applying, let's say, I can't compare between UK and Syria, because there is top-bottom approach. Community never consulted about things to be done. Even community sometimes, if you think about Marotta city, might be refunded was taken in a way take roads or to make garden. They might be refunded on a very, very old financial education of the prices of this. So that's back in Syria. It's really clear top-down approach where things come government using scholars or involving scholars, yes, universities and from professional bodies. But here the problem is not the problem. Let's say the responsibility should be scholars and architects. And that's why maybe education or architectural education need to change way to respond to these challenges and to understand how it's not about how to get bottom-up approach or how to use data coming from bottom-up approach to respond or to inform the bottom strategy, because I understand that the bottom-up approach has local dimension to it, but top-bottom approach is more strategic and larger scale. So how those two approaches meet is really important. Now we are in the process of writing up a fund to the GC fund run by HRC, which basically how we can transform or change or reconstruct the architecture education Syria or architecture curriculum Syrian university to respond to the post-conflict regeneration needs.
That's great, Tarek. I have two questions from Karen and one from Rebecca. From Karen, if I understood well, she asked, to what extent is it cross-cultural that we need community spaces? And Karen, I hope I understood. If not, you unmute your mic. And the question from, I lost it. The question from Rebecca, let me find it. Have you found that creating a living experience of archaeology has revealed more about how these historic places were used? I'm specifically interested in public spaces. And the last question, Linda, thanks you as well. The social activity and changes in the camps are fascinating. Are they being mapped? How are people remembered and activities engaged with in the reconstructions? You have three fascinating questions.
Yeah.
And also
with Karen question. Yeah.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, Tarek. I just wanted to say to colleagues as well that at one point, once Tarek has responded to all these questions, feel free to also take the floor, because I suppose that you're coming from these different disciplines, including architecture. It's really interesting to hear your perspectives. But Tarek, go ahead.
Yeah. The first question: how much do you think this is cross-cultural, that actually all peoples need community? Karen, if I'm not wrong, you are referring to the community space or the social, creating a social spaces. If you can clarify that. I believe it's cross-culture, because if you look at some architectural or urban settlements here in the UK, designed by using different typologies like blocks typology or urban settlements with social hubs or social spaces, open space between them, you can see the different social dynamic between the two types. You can see really clear social segregation between people who are living just in a block with no open space or with no gathering space for them. It's about having garden around the block. It's about really having protected and gathering space for families from different age groups. So that bring all these people together for different activities. A question, in a way, living experience is really amazing, because to present and show people not only how those spaces were used, because we really did more stuff or more detailed stuff using a program called Real Time Engine or Unreal Engine, sorry, that animation and make people think, construct historic activities, making or wine making or etc. But in archaeology in particular, since it's sensitive, very sensitive physical, tangible heritage, digital tools is really important for both sides. Bringing living experience, just to get that, and the space in particular, because when creating the plaza, when the proposal involved only reconstructing the facades, this activity around the plaza, the aim has twofold, or was twofold. First of all, reconstructing the geometry of the plaza. That means allowing people to understand that the concept of facade came back 2,000 years later. People were considering opening windows into open space, putting essential activities, commercial activities, entertaining activities into the open space. The archaeological data even confirmed that people built the facade or the wall overlooking or looking over this plaza in thicker and more and better architectural quality. That means people really understood the concept of facade and looking over in important space like this public plaza in a way, in a proper way. Before, there is misunderstanding that the concept of facade came much later in the history, but there is archaeological data that confirms that people understood that I have my facade into the plaza, so I open it, I open window, I engage between inside and outside. Basically, how a digital tool helped me to communicate the proposal. And the last question is about how, if it's mapped. The study I showed you, I can share. I'm referencing it. You can find it. I can share the PDF as well with all. It has mapped how the landscape of a camp has changed using digital tools to understand how the morphology of the landscape changed between from a grid into agglomeration, let's say, or complexes for either each family or each tribe or each like how they divided themselves. Because I can tell you that those people coming from living in the Zatari camp are coming from the same region, which is Dara and its surrounding, which is southern of Syria. So they have this mentality of family, not only the small family, but the bigger family need to come together. So that's why you could start to see that not every 2 or 3 or even sometimes 5 containers came together to create a small plaza for this family, and it tends to have supplementary activity between those containers. But in the meantime, all those complexes came to have one big plaza for social gathering. So at different levels of privacy, which needed, considering the cultural background those people coming from. So maybe I needed to tell you a bit about Syria. Syria has very diverse social backgrounds and requirements of privacy in the same city, coming from a multicultural and multi-religious society that live together in the same city or in the same region.
Thank you very much, Tarek. I think we have time for last question. You have Yazid, who thanks you for your presentation. And the question is, how are you planning to use your research on archaeological heritage to create an alternative architecture or urban plan to the new globalized models like the one you described, the city of Morata? And after you responded to that, feel free to take the floor if you want to add up something from your own discipline.
So thanks, Yazid. That's really important question, and this is. I hope you are going to receive email about this workshop we are doing in Jordan and participate if you are interested in that, because regenerating cities really need intensive architectural, social, and cultural background to inform these values, to inform the reconstruction of the city by values coming from those readings. So you are mentioning archaeological heritage. My research, if you are referring to archaeological I've done for Ugarit. Ugarit is related to different civilization. Of course, we are not. I'm not in a way proposing that we bring all the pattern or all the ancient habits to inform our new cities. What I'm proposing here that archaeological analysis or cultural reading, social reading of heritage, like if we say analyzing the old city of Homs, understanding how those courtyard houses that let's say characterize the city, the old city of Homs, how they work and how they created first of all social cohesion, as a very good environmental internal and external environmental settings for inhabitants. This knowledge must be transferred in a very contemporary architecture. Let's look at Masdar City, for example. Although I'm not really a fan of Masdar City, but Norman Foster, based on his physical representation of architecture as well as urban organization and resolution of the city, by understanding the requirements of the environment there, the requirement of people there, and the privacy of the building. So he built in concrete and steel, of course, but he covered the buildings with a contemporary interpretation of Mashrabiya, which are historic element added to windows in historic towns. So IM is informing new reconstructions or new regeneration policies or proposals, which is the interpretation, contemporary interpretation of our cultural aspects presented in architectural interventions or architectural proposal. Of course, can happen, but if you look at Marota City, for example, Marota City is a tower block arranged complex, glass and shiny material. First of all, is not, if we consider a country coming from war, it's not really a representation of the economic situation in the country. This is starting with the economy, because normal people will not be affording, will not afford to have a small, even small flat in this. This meant to be for rich people. So more social segregation under a slum or a fancy flat. That's not a touch upon social justice in the country, in the post-conflict situation. But also for country that has above 40 degree, this type of resolutions with this type of glass is not environmentally and economically efficient for people who will have to use ACs inside their spaces because they have this amount of glass. the urban heat island or the urban heat effect outside for external spaces will be higher. So the temperature will be higher in the external spaces because of the social radiation reflection from the building into this outer space. So if you compare it with the urban arrangement of old towns, or even some very old towns in Syria, you can see that the shadow is an important aspect. Allowing people to live in shadowed urban external environment is important for a country like Syria or Arab Emirates, for example. If we look about Arab Emirates now, they can't afford or can't tolerate the heat outside, not because of it's 40 or 45 degrees, but also because of additional temperature coming from the urban island effect happening because of these shiny or even smooth surfaces applied to these buildings. So even we need really to think about everything, the concept, the general urban concept, to the material used in our building to respond to these. So it's not only urban architecture, but also social. The situation in Syria after conflict, if you need to accommodate people lost their homes, lost their properties, you really need to think about approach to social thing, but in a way that respond to cultural aspect. Thinking about, of course, we can always do fancy buildings for rich people, but the priority is now for people who can't afford living elsewhere. They need really funds.
Thank you so much, Tarek, again. I see we have 5 minutes left to reflect upon what Tarek said. Architecture is probably one of the most interdisciplinary fields, really. The politics of architecture, the imposition of certain architectural model by authoritarian states, architecture and the environment, architecture and technology. There's so much to say. Colleagues, do you want to take the floor? Is there something you'd like to contribute to? Don't be shy, we are not so many. You can just turn on your camera and your mic if there is something particular you'd like to add. No, not really. Tarek, would you like to say something?
Very much. I can see that some colleagues joined us from Jordan. Very much. I think they could have also contributed to from their knowledge of other things affecting heritage. We are working together on that in terms of climate. I'm not ignoring other aspects that, of course, that affecting heritage. Climate change is one key one that's sharing the globe. Okay, here we are really care about how coastal heritage is suffering from the climate change, but also inland heritage as well is not excluded. But also our colleagues in Jordan have really great experience on working against climate change effect on heritage. Very particular heritage called Betra. Hope you know it, and they are dealing with this. So thank you, Lynn, for joining us today. And thank you for all, of course, for joining us today. That's a pleasure to share with you my thinking about heritage and my future plan about it.
Thank you so much again, Tarek. That was really fascinating. You hear about Tarek again. We have together a global challenge project and the plan for a big conference in Lebanon, which is certainly going to happen. We'll see when exactly. So thanks very much. That was really very interesting. We have 2-3 more minutes. I'd like to make a few announcements. So first of all, thanks very much to the team, Olga, Marika, Andy, and her for their support. Next week, we're going to have another webinar. So actually, it's going to be every week. So please come, no matter what's the topic. Next week, interestingly, we'll have our Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Bob Nichol, on the question, I get to understand why is the sky dark. Any idea? I don't yet have an idea, but I'm sure next week I'll have more of an idea why the sky is dark. After we'll have Professor Asif Qureshi from the University of Korea joining us from Seoul to talk about the Americanization of trade. So that I know much better, I think. And the week again after, we'll have our colleague Professor Tamsin Bradley and myself, and most probably a few other external colleagues to talk about the future of development aid in times of pandemic. So that's it for now, and I wish to see all of you and many more next week for Bob's seminar. Thank you very much again, Tarek. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.